Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to Tapas Project Shala. This is Tapas Project Shala, a virtual conference meant for educators and parents. I'm your host, Preeti Vikram, founder of Tapas Progressive School. Today, we have a fascinating guest who is going to be talking to us so much about experiential learning. We are joined by Bedard, who is a social entrepreneur, an experiential educator, community facilitator, keynote speaker, co-founder of the Jump Foundation. Justin, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, Priti. Thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor to be part of this virtual event, and I'm very excited to jump into this conversation around one of my biggest passions in life, which is experiential learning and innovating education. To give a brief introduction, Jump is a nonprofit social enterprise, and our mandate is to make transformational learning, life-changing experiences accessible to all. And the way in which we do that is we run programs for underserved youth from communities that are under-resourced. And those are a mentorship program, a leadership program that builds the capacity of those youth to have high impact on their community and the world. The way in which we fund those programs is that we work with private schools and international schools around the world, and we run leadership development programs and experiential education programs and different innovation projects for the private international schools. And then we generate revenue through that, and then we fund our programs for underserved youth. We've worked with over 50,000 youth since our founding, and we've worked in 25 different countries. We currently have offices in Canada, Bangkok, and in Budapest, and we run projects all over the world, inclusive of India. So I'm excited to be talking to all of these passionate educators and parents in India. So I'll pass it back to you, Priti, to ask whatever questions you have. I'll do my best to provide answers and have a great conversation here.
Yeah. So, for the viewers, Justin and I are part of this community of educators, fabulous community of educators, and just listening to Justin talk about all the work that they do, it kind of goes back to why that community was created. So, Justin, first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conference. I think let's begin right at the beginning. It's a great place to start. So, let's talk a little bit about what your definition of experiential learning is and why you see that as something different from other conventional approaches to learning.
So I think my definition of experiential learning is actually not that different than what some people would call conventional learning. I think primarily I'll just define it as this. I think it happens all over the world. I think it happens in many different places. And the real focus of experiential learning is that you're having an experience, you're learning through that experience, then you're reflecting on it and you're integrating those learnings back into who you come out on the other side of that cycle of learning. And so at home, that could be making bread with your mom and dad and learning about the chemistry and the math and all of the different things. And so there's tons of experiential learning that happens at home, kids and parents and grandparents. And I think that's one of the most powerful spaces for experiential learning, because kids are most comfortable making mistakes in that place. And that's such an important part of experiential learning, is the comfort to fail and to make mistakes. So I always talk about home being one of the greatest places to see experiential learning, because that's where kids will be their most vulnerable and their most authentic. And that's a core component of experiential learning. And then in the context of what we would call traditional schools, I really define any experience where students are having an interactive engagement. And so that could be a drama class, it could be a chemistry class, it could even be a PE class, that they're learning through the experience that they're having and their reflection of the experience they had. And so a lot of times people think of experiential learning as you have to go off campus. I think some of the most powerful experiential learning that happens is actually on campus. And then in the context of an outdoor education, how I define it is really when kids are stepping outside and being outside the comfort zone, which is either home or school, and starting to experience and stretch what's possible and who they are and what they can achieve either physically or environmentally, and then they learn from that change. And we also see a similar thing when you go into a culture that's not the same as yours. So I may walk into a different school that is a Catholic school, and I'm usually at a Buddhist school, or I may go into a completely different country that has a different culture to it. And that difference of that culture, there's lots of reflection in that, and that power of creating learning in that. And so when we talk about experiential learning, I think it's about these different types of experiences, the reflection once you have that difference in that experience, and then how do you integrate that back into yourself. um, and it's similar to like a lot of the project-based learning ideas that happen. I think one of the key principles of experiential learning is that it's a little bit unstructured, and you also don't really have control of the outcome. The learner really drives that, and we as educators or parents or facilitators are working around it, but not driving it forward. That's my long-winded answer to your question.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And I think as a project based learning school, we understand the importance of learning
Mm,
by doing,
mm,
having to practically apply everything that we've learned into a meaningful context
mm.
when it comes to the knowledge that has been acquired. So I think we understand each other very well, and we're aligned in that.
Yeah.
Uh, but why do you think today more than ever before, experiential learning is more important for the way the learners are growing and developing? Why do you think that it's critical at this point?
There's so many dynamics of complexity that I think are happening in the world. If it's the speed at which globalization has changed how the world works, or it's AI, or it's the polarization of culture and politics. I think the anchor of what allows for people to navigate through that, I think experiential education creates a stabilizing force. And some of the key, the research that experiential education professionals and researchers, when they look at what are the core outcomes, the main one that comes out is self-awareness and confidence. And so as the world is complex and changing around us, giving kids the ability to really see who they are and have confidence in who they are gives them an anchor point to then operate in the chaos and the conflict and the challenge that is turbulent around us. And so experiential education, really the process of reflecting and going through experiential learning, gives people self-awareness and the confidence that's anchored in there. um, I think another big piece is metacognition. And so really understanding how we learn and really understanding how we think, and that reflective process of I failed, and how did that make me feel, and why did I feel that way. That journey really gives people an understanding of the process of thinking, and that allows for, how, what is the impact of AI. I don't even know what the impact of AI is going to be, and so I can get lost in this esoteric conversation, but really anchoring into, okay, here's how my mind works, and here's how I work, and how I can operate in that space, I think is the second piece. And then a lot of experiential education, and you heard me say failure a little bit. A lot of experiential education is about building resilience. And there's uh, the Outward Bound movement. One of their big models, because they were this Navy program that came out of World War II, where the people weren't going to war. So how do we build something that builds robustness in individuals? And the slogan and the motto of Outward Bound is to strive and not to yield. And
Hmm.
that's that rough and tumble how you build resilience. And I mean, I really like a little bit of a switch on that, and it's just a nuance of language, is to strive. So really do big things, like really strive for big things, um, and to yield. So it's actually about yielding to yourself and understanding and learning in yourself, and yield to those dynamics that are around you. And it's the concept of the strength of the willow that goes with the wind. versus the willow that fights against the wind. And so that resilience, experiential education really brings this dynamic of people's ability to operate in complexity. And I really think that those three things. There's lots of other things that experiential education does, but self-awareness and confidence, metacognition, and the strength of resilience. That's what young people and human beings, I think, need as the world gets faster paced and more complex. And that's why I think it's, one of the most important things to be doing for young people. It's why I've dedicated my life to it.
Fabulous. Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. As the world outside is getting more and more chaotic, we just work inside. So I think we travel inward, which has been the cornerstone of anything that you look at from an Indian perspective. I think we've always been very mindful. The kind of yoga practices, meditation that all comes from here is reflective of
Mm,
how we work on ourselves. So
mm,
I think it fits beautifully with what we value as a nation, but somehow
mm,
we've gotten the way when it comes to education. We've disconnected the two. Maybe it's time to bring back that connection. There have been great thinkers like J. Krishnamurti in India
mm,
who have placed so much importance on the metacognition part of it, asking the
mm.
questions, doing the work of understanding yourself and understanding where you are with respect to the world around you. I think that was a fabulous point that you brought up. Thank you so much, Justin, for that.
Well, I just want to jump in here because when I
Yes.
was in my maybe in my 20s, late
Hmm.
20s, a friend of mine came and threw down a book. He said, "You've got to read this book by this amazing Indian philosopher, Krishnamurti." And so
Yeah.
I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but I read the book and I was moved by it, and I was transfixed in, and all these are great concepts. And then I went off and I became an outdoor experiential educator. And I had forgotten about the book. Some of the practices and principles I
Hmm.
definitely took into my practice of being an educator. And and then there's uh, all of these amazing innovators in experiential education, um, who built the frame of what is experiential education in a Western context.
Yeah.
And we put them all on these pedestals and we learn from them, and so I build that out. And then I actually went to in Pune a couple of months ago in November. I went to a conference there, um, and Krishnamurti came back up, and obviously in the conversations. And I mean, I went back to some of his writings, and I think he holds the strongest in the world against any of these Western writers on what is true experiential education. I think he anchors into some of that metacognition in a really, really powerful way. And I think, unfortunately, the way that Western education developed in terms of at least the British Western education, it became very like, industrialized, and it kind of came up against a lot of those Indian frameworks of the Gurukulas or Krishnamurti, and this concept of project-based learning or learning from systems. And then this British education system comes in and says, here's how we're going to industrialize education. And so, I mean, I do think that there's so much, and I've really loved what time I have in my current journey to go back to some of Krishnamurti's writings, and I'm trying to explore it a little bit more. I think there's lots of stuff in there that I don't even know, and so I think thanks for bringing that name back up. I think it is a really wise move is to lean into some of that indigenous knowledge and that indigenous context.
Absolutely. And it warms my heart when you bring up the Gurukulas and when you bring up these names that we hold so dear at Tapas. So
Mm,
thank you so much for that. So we started off with the what is experiential education. We looked at the why of experiential education. I think we should now look at, can you give us a few examples of what work you've done so that there is concrete evidence of what experiential learning looks like?
yeah, so I mean, I don't like to make it about me or the work that jumps in. I like to really talk about what kids have done, and the work that um, youth and teachers and educators do. And so I think there's three really strong examples, and there's so much powerful experiential learning that happens on school campuses or through trips. but there's three that really stand out for me in my journey. Um, One is a small project that started in about 2006, and it was a group of students and a teacher, and their idea was, how do we build a social enterprise, a small little club or social enterprise that goes and does an exploration of creating sustainable coffee and selling sustainable coffee beans in a marketplace on the school campus. And so it was essentially called the Pro Farmer Project. And the beauty of it was all based off of needs assessments and understanding, okay, what is the needs of some of the farmers we want to work with, and then there was an understanding of what's the need of the market in Beijing at the time, and they then built this product, and they basically built a sustainable coffee bean. They went to a coffee roaster that was in Beijing and was sourcing beans from southern China, and they built this small enterprise with inside the school that would generate value and sell these coffee beans at different events, and then they would generate revenue and surplus through that, and then they take that money and they'd run development projects for the communities where the coffee was coming from. And I mean, I think there's different examples of this at different schools where they build these types of projects. But one of the things that I really liked about this is that the premise of when it first started was there was a strong anchoring in legacy and sustainability of the enterprise, not just the project. And they have it's a culture of handing the project over and over, and so they don't do any fundraising. There's not no like go to your school and raise money. It's all about building this value that they're then selling to their community, and it's lasted for 20 years. They've moved into different products where they've tried to sell different types of vegetables, and then they moved into chocolates, and so they played around with different markets, in terms of products, and then in the marketing and distribution. It's just been a really powerful lesson. And so I was at an alumni event for this school that this project was from, and in Bangkok actually. And one of the kids who had gone through the program in its earlier years is now running one of the largest currency conversion applications. They actually do remittance. It's not remittances, but it's basically creating currency conversion for Indian students and Chinese students that are
Okay.
studying in Canada, the US, and America. But when you ask him, like, how did where did you learn some of these business skills? He's the CEO of a, multi-million dollar organization. And the anchor of it was, I learned it through this Pro Farmer Project, the sustainable business. So in terms of, I think it's a beautiful example of experiential education being something that is a small start thing. It kind of grows slowly, and we never really know the impact of that type of learning. Yeah, so that is a example number one. Do you want me to give a couple more, or is that enough?
Yes, it's exciting. Please do.
So another one that I really like is an outdoor leadership enterprise program. And so a group of international school kids that we worked with wanted to build an outdoor adventure program where they were running programs for themselves and for Special Olympics kids, and then for migrant youth. So these are young people who are working, their parents are working in construction sites, they're not living where their hometown is. And so they're underserved in the communities. And the idea was, how do we build these trips and expeditions so that the Special Olympics kid, the migrant school kid, and the international school kid, they're not seen as one needing more than the other, but they work as a team on different types of challenges. So it could be hiking and GPS challenge, or it could be kayaking, or it could be rock climbing. But it's all about team connection and collectivity. And one of the power of this is the expedition, number one, but then two is what privilege is, and that exploration of privilege isn't always social economic,
Right.
and skills are different. So, for example, we needed to build a fire, and the migrant school kids are like, yeah, we can build a fire. International school kids couldn't really build a fire, and the Special Olympic kids weren't really able to build a fire. And the migrant school kids were the real fire starters
Mm.
in that setting. Then the international school kids, they speak some of the different dialects, and so they were able to speak and translate between the group. And then the Special Olympic kids are having lots of fun and bringing a lot of energy and community and sense of connectivity. And so this element of strength in diversity, I think for years and years after I talk to kids who have done this program, they talk about that strength of understanding in the diversity. Um, and then the third example is in Thailand. There's an organization called Bring the Elephant Home,
Okay.
and we started working with them and running different trips. And I think the key component is our kids that we take on these, the expeditions to this area where they have elephant conservation. This group does basically ecotourism slash sustainable development, and it's really about building the capacity of communities to live with elephants and not um, attack elephants because they
Mm.
consume their crops. And
Mm.
part of the process of the students were coming up with basically going through a design thinking framework and building products that the students were from Singapore, and they were trying to create products for that this group, the collective of conservation, elephant conservation people, could sell to the Singaporean market. And so they were doing a design thinking of like, what do people want? What are the needs, assets, and the strengths of this, rural community in Thailand? And how does that rural community then create some products that then can serve and be sold um, in Singapore? And so they built some products and built some ideas, and they beta tested them, and then slowly this Bring the Elephant Home collective has been building out the products that they offer to communities. And so it's kind of like an alignment and an ally to development, but not a concept of serving or going into communities and serving. So those are three, I think, super impactful projects in different formats and frameworks. And as the concept of experiential education, there's not one size of what it can look like.
Fabulous. I love all three examples, and I'm going to look after this call. I'm going to look for opportunities of how we can collaborate with Tapas and Jump,
Mm,
but that's a separate conversation.
mm,
Um, from what you said just now, I think is so clear that the learning that's happening is, of course, much beyond what they would learn in their textbooks or while
mm,
preparing to get their exams for meeting those standards, etc. But much beyond that, the angle that they are not just consumers of the world, but they are actually
mm,
contributing as citizens of the world.
mhm,
And because they now are thinking what are the problems that this particular community has or this particular
mhm,
area has, and then solving for that, and that just changes the perspective. And I think that's what teenagers need today more than ever before, that perspective of doing something bigger, greater, having
mm.
an impact that affects them. So very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. But then that brings me to the question of what happens. How can they balance between learning, that is the curriculum that is set by a particular board, and then how does that change the academic structures of the schools that you work with?
Yeah, I actually it's a uh funny situation because we'll work with some of these, high powered schools around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we love experiential education. We love, like, how do we do all this stuff without disrupting, the academic timetable and the academic structures? And they'll ask me this complex question and expect me to give the answer,
Yeah.
being an expert in experiential education. And my answer is very, very simple. You can't. You can't do really profound, powerful experiential learning without changing the structure. And the analogy that I usually use is the concept of, you can't lose weight unless you eat differently or you exercise. Like those are the two fundamental components that you can't lose weight unless you do those two things.
Yeah.
And you can't mobilize and see and activate the true value of experiential learning until
Mm.
you change the two main constraints in education,
Mm-hmm.
the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so experiential learning, it can't be constrained by time. And so if you have a 45-minute block or a 90-minute block, if you keep it contained or constrained in that block, um, it loses its power. And so you, for sure, you can do a really experiential, powerful chemistry lesson in 90 minutes, or you can do an experiential exploration of poverty in 90 minutes. But if you really want to see the full scope of it, you need to give it time to explore. And then the second thing is the space and where the learning is done. And so those are the two things that traditional education, industrialized education, really come up against is time and space. And
Mm.
so the strength, I believe, is in creating off timetable blocks, um, in terms of maybe it's one day a month, maybe it's one day a year, maybe it's half a day a year. I'm not sort of saying one thing is better than the other, but I really think it is about creating unstructured blocks of time that
Mm.
young people can explore in partnership with adults. Um, yeah, these concepts, and I think there's a retraining of the learner, and there needs to be also a retraining of the educator of how
Mm.
to operate in those blocks of time. And
Correct.
so if you just create an unstructured block of time and you say, okay, we're creating this unstructured block of time, we're going to do all this innovative stuff, the old roles, our old patterns of being a pupil and a teacher will, that's how they'll interact. But I think it's
Yeah.
really important to create those blocks and also train the student to say, on Heart's Ladder, you're now taking active participation in your learning journey and you're
Mm-hmm.
driving this process forward and you're co-learning with your adult coach or your learning coach or your facilitator or your educator. They're not teaching you, but they're collaborating with you in a learning journey. And I
Mm-hmm.
totally understand, like, accessible criteria, you have to get certain metrics in place. I don't think you can blow up school forever, but I think creating these blocks of space and time where that type of interaction can happen is really important. And also upskilling both the young person and upskilling the educators to be skilled in operating in that unstructured space.
Beautiful. As a project-based learning school, this is a question that I often have to
Mm,
answer because,
mm,
how are you balancing both academics as well as
mm,
projects? This is something that I
mm,
have to answer. And I think tying back to what you said, two things that for me have worked with Tapas. One is that when we do a project, right, when we take up a project, it's transdisciplinary, which
mm,
means that I'm doing science, social sciences, English, math, etc., everything woven into one, which means that I have suddenly a lot more blocks opening up because within that project,
mm,
I am able to cover all these subjects without having to tell the learner that today we are going to do science or today we
mm,
are going to do geography or history. So I think the power of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary learning is what we need to harness for
mm,
making experiential education possible. I think that's one thing I'd like to tie back to what you said. And the second thing I think is very powerful is when you spoke about retraining of the young adults as well as the educators. It's about placing the onus of learning on the
mm,
adult or the young adult, right? On the student there, when
mm,
they believe that the onus is with them, is when this entire shift happens.
mm,
Um, for that, the educator has to let go of being the sage on the stage, and then the learner has to really take charge of their own learning. And so, this shift in the mindset is what helps us create powerful projects, powerful experiences, which can
mm.
be a great way of learning. So I mean that's something that I would like to add on, and this is what schools and parents should be trying to do at home as well. So I just wanted to
Yeah,
add what you said.
I wonder from like your school. when you see students come in, I always think this is the nuance and the sweet spot of the
Mm-hmm.
observation is when
Mm-hmm.
you have a traditional teacher walk into a project-based learning environment
Right.
and the sense of uncomfort that they
Yeah.
feel. I always say, okay, I can see it happening, and there's stuff all over the place, and I can see it happening inside you. Like that's reflect on why that's there. And the same
Mm-hmm.
thing with a student. I imagine this happens. I mean, I'm opening it up to a question, but what has been your experience as you have teachers and students that aren't used to operating in that project-based environment when they come in? What is their initial reaction, and then how do they process all that?
Okay, so the interviewer becomes the interviewee.
I'm just asking a question of I think it's intriguing.
Yeah, thank you for that. My experience in the last 4 years has been that none of us have gone through learning in this format. We've gone through a
Mm-hmm.
very, very conventional, traditional forms of
Mm-hmm.
what you mentioned as industrial kinds of schools, industrial
Mm-hmm.
education systems. And so there's a lot of relearning and unlearning that has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Most educators are this will not work. There's
Mm-hmm.
no way that I can execute projects and get them to learn within this kind of time. And so
Mm-hmm.
um, I think by the end of the first project, which lasts for about 6 to 8 weeks, we start seeing that they go like, this can work. And so we see that shift in the mindset that happens. But of course, a lot of hand holding throughout their time.
Mm-hmm.
We see that they take once they have experienced themselves the joy of learning through projects, the joy of learning experientially, they are hooked. Even the
Mm-hmm.
educators in the classroom want to do it this way. With learners, thankfully, we've had the community of learners that are there at Tapas. Thankfully, we've had most of the parents who are in alignment with us. So they've done some amount of the change in the perspectives at home as well, so it
Mm-hmm.
works very well with us. But when we do have learners coming in who have had some amount of schooling in a conventional setup, when they come into us again, a similar learning curve happens. They take time to unlearn that they are the pupil and they have to wait for
Mm-hmm.
instructions. There's not as much initiative that they are able to take up as what we see in learners who've been with us for a few years now. So it takes a little bit of unlearning and relearning, but hey, we're not in a hurry, so it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a fascinating component with what is the purpose of education.
Mm.
And one of our colleagues, friends from Oppie, I was on a call with him, and you know, very contrarian. We were deep in conversation and battling back and forth of like, how do we innovate education to be really powerful? And um, the question was, Justin, what is the core most valuable part of education to parents?
Mm.
And I said, I think it's the parents want their kids to have values education, the kids. And then I went into this big thing, and their response was, those are all fantastic components. But the
Yeah.
main thing is that the parent wants the kid to not be with them so that they can work. And and I it hit me, it hit so close to home because I'd never thought about that. Like I never thought of that's why people were sending their kids to school. And I do think that there's this dynamic of that shift of what the purpose of education is has
Mm.
to change at the core. If we talk about a user experience, the parent being the primary user of it, if we're
Mm.
just talking about a daycare, we'll never be able to move away from uh, it just being, take care of my kids, make sure they don't die. If there's other stuff, that's great. But I do think that like the primary clientele is, as you said, the parents of your school who are at home. They bought into the framework.
Yeah.
They allow for the innovation to happen, and that's where I think it's so important on the. And I love that there's parents as part of this conference and this online engagement, because I think changing the expectations that parents have of education, that it is
Mm-hmm.
more than just a daycare, is really the only way that I think education will innovate. It's kind of like Darwin's, the environment will force the evolution. And I think for us to hold education to a higher standard of what we expect for education to do will then force education to evolve in the way in which you're evolving. And I know it's kind of cart before the horse. Like you guys built the
Yeah.
school and then probably brought the parents into it, but that creates this ecosystem where you can really do super innovative stuff. And the same thing with Jump. We work with some of the most privileged, affluent schools in the world, and we're able to innovate in that space. And then we take the surplus from that, and we're able to do our own innovations in our own space. But in the
Mm-hmm.
grander scheme of things, the market just wants someone to take care of their kids. So
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still grappling with this. It's a recent conversation, but it's relevant to this conversation.
It's very interesting, and that's a great segue for my next question because you spoke about AI a little while earlier, and now you're talking about the evolution of education changing. So, my next question is what do you think are the future trends when it comes to how jobs will look like, and then how does experiential learning prepare students for that? So, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not a futurist, and there's lots of great people to read about
Sure.
what it is. I mean, I kind of I look at trends and I look at what Google and um, Meta and all of the big multinationals, basically they have their own academies on their campuses where they do really powerful learning and development, which is interdisciplinary, is really about mental health and well-being, grounding yourself. It is this really robust learning environment that they bring, they hire people into, and then they basically have these internal universities that are super interdisciplinary, super dynamic, fantastic. And that's when you hire, you get to go into that. Um, our post-secondary education structure is a traditional industrialization of subject based, and tenure basically controls what that is. And then the acceptance into universities is controlled as well. And so I do think that a lot of our secondary and primary education is forced to what it needs to do, not because of what the future of work is, but because of this institution of post-secondary education, which needs to be blown up and changed. And I think there's some really great universities that are doing that. And tenure, I think is the death of innovation in education. Tenure in post-secondary. So the reason I say all that is that I think that's the framework of what do kids need, and what I see happening is kids need resilience, they need independence, they need self-awareness, they need all the things that I was talking about before: community and connection, empathy, self-efficacy. That's what allows for people to be really successful, A++ high performers in government, in politics, in industry and technology, whatever it is. That's the thing that people really can be successful. um, and I think there's a lot of good primary education that does that and builds those components, and then we shift in the secondary space to move to these subject based specific function, get good results on these exams so you can get into the university, so that you can be taught by a tenured professor that is only doing one subject, and then you get this degree, and then you go back out into industry and they blow up the degree and say we actually need people that are interdisciplinary. So I mean, the reason I say that is that I think what the future of work is really what a lot of primary education is teaching, and we need to
Yeah.
drive that forward even more, and break that post-secondary monopoly that they have on controlling what education is.
Great. I think I like what you said about how secondary education and especially higher education with your college degrees, etc., are really useless today because when you get into work is when you get trained for the work that you have to do.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us were trained to do the work that we were doing today back in our college.
Exactly.
So I really like that piece that you said. I do believe that unfortunately, even the primary education system where I'm coming from has lost its way a little bit. And
Hmm.
when students do pass out after, say, their 12th grade of what we call high school in India,
Hmm.
um, they're not ready for the job market. And today, when the gig economy is so huge across the world, the people who are dropping out of college, dropping out of high school, getting into smaller gigs, and that trend will continue going forward. So it puts more and more pressure on the primary schooling level itself to
Hmm.
equip them with the skills that you mentioned, which is your self awareness, resilience, metacognition, all of these skills, I think, have to get developed sooner and sooner in
Hmm.
primary education itself. So I think that kind of sums up what
Hmm.
what we need and what I think the future will look like
Hmm.
as well. So I'm not a futurist, just like you. I'm just looking at the trends that's going on, and this is what I think might happen as well.
Yeah, I also like to think
So
about. Uh, I'll say
yes.
one more thing around just like the. I think there's the future, and then I think there's the next 5 years. And I think that there's four core things that I see as huge needs of young people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a mental health crisis that's connected to social media and the dynamic um, there. I think there is an element of kids losing, and both again from technology, but also the pressures of the world and the seriousness of the world. Like kids are losing the ability to just have fun and be kids. I mean, that's such an
Yeah.
important part of our growth as human beings, is to have those memories and to have that anchoring of play um, with others. So I think, yeah, a mental health crisis. There's a kid psychology around needing to be in play more. I believe there's
Mm-hmm.
also a nature deficit disorder that's forming where I'm not saying people need to go become hippies and live in the forest, but I think that there's a connectivity to nature which I believe people are missing out on, and I think there's a power to that, even if it's just a walk in a park or
Mm.
listening to birds. I think there's an awareness and appreciation for nature that we're losing, and there's some climate change implications to that, but there's also just some basic human well-being that I think that deficit. And then I think there's a sense of belonging when we look at all this polarization that's happening. I think it's that people are afraid and they don't feel safe and connected to community. And our nature as human beings is, you know, we've survived and innovated as a species because we come together. Not the lone wolf never survives. It's always the pack. And that's how humans, came into to form and doing really crazy stuff, building the world that we have today. And so that sense of belonging, I think, is another, big piece that needs to be focused on. So when I look at what the future of education is, I gave some ideas there, but I really think the next 5 years, those are the four buckets that schools, educators, and myself, but I'm really focused on. I have two kids, so that's where my focus is, but the work that we do with also as Jump with kids is in those four buckets of sense of belonging, connection to nature, letting kids play, and then supporting people in this, mental health crisis that's forming for preteens and teens across the world.
Uh, yeah, I think I couldn't agree more when you talk about especially the sense of belonging.
Mm,
I see the urban Indian kids today, they are so
mm,
lost because most of the content that they consume is not from
mm,
our own country, it's
mm,
from somewhere else. There is a huge demand of K-pop and K-drama and
mm,
all of that on the one side, and then there's been the Western influence that's been going on for the longest now. So that
mm,
sense of belonging comes when the sense of identity is there. So
mm,
I think that I do believe that we need to focus on giving them a reason
mm,
to proud of their heritage, feel proud of where they are coming from, and have that sense of identity, which then leads to the
mm,
sense of belongingness. and I can't
Mhm.
talk enough about mental health. We have 10-year-olds talking about stress today, and they're talking
Mhm.
about, I'm feeling anxious. And so they have the vocabulary, but they don't know how to deal
Mhm.
with this. I think mental health is something that we definitely have to look at addressing in the next few years. And I'm so happy you brought up nature.
Mhm.
And this is something I wanted to share with you, Justin, that before we constructed the Tapas campus, we asked learners from across India what they would want in their ideal campus to
Mhm.
be, right? And 85% of them responded with wanting to do
Mhm.
something more with nature. It seems like such a common sense
Yeah.
aspect, but schools have ignored that for so long. And we just, I mean, it's just so tragic that we have made students sit within four walls and expect them to learn better. I don't know how that works, even, because it just goes against everything developmentally appropriate for the child. So we constructed our campus to give as much interaction with nature as possible for every learner at Tapas. Um, our, whether it's our classroom, our library, our makerspace, every space has a bit of an indoor and an outdoor. We have skylights in the classroom
Oh,
so the kids can look up into the sky, and it's beautifully nestled in nature. So I think we have to find ways to bring nature closer to the students if we can't take the students out to nature. So,
well,
uh, or
well,
maybe little.
I have a really good friend who's a deep mathematician, and
Mhm.
their their frame on it is people forget that the the thing that drove most people into math and to create equations was to understand the natural world. Like, why does this happen? And so basically everything in the natural world drove humans, before when we were forming and agriculture comes and there's all sorts of, okay, now we have time to sit and think, well, why does this happen this way? And why does this happen this way? And how does what this is a weird dynamics. Let's try and figure this out. And so that's, I mean, the element of doing math without an exploration of nature and the dynamics and the
Mhm.
systems that are in play in nature seems like, trying to play basketball without, shooting a ball. Right? It's like you kind of have to go back to that core of
Yeah.
why did we even, build these frameworks for learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It might be interesting for you if you aren't, you would want to look up the work of KB Jinan. I don't know if you've come across his
Mm.
work. He works with indigenous communities in India and looks at education from their perspective. One of the
Cool.
lines that he said that stayed with me for a very long time, and I continue to believe that, is the literate learns the word, but the illiterate learns the world. And
Yeah.
it's such a powerful
Mm.
sentence. Like, and he talks about how, because today we've become so used to reading from books,
Yep.
we're not constructing our own knowledge systems. We're not constructing thought in our own head. So I love what you said, and I just connected this to what KB Jinan said. This
Mhm.
is
I love it.
fabulous. We're almost at the end of our time available, so I'm going to ask you, your parting thoughts about what is the educator and parents' role when it comes to making those mindset shifts for making experiential learning successful.
Um, what do I do first, parents or educators? So I think uh, the teacher, the educator. I'm a huge. I love Hart's ladder of participation. I think it gives a really good framework if the participants in this conference, HART apostrophe S ladder LADDER of participation. And it essentially just frames out different levels of how you participate with young people in their engagement in life. And the top level of it is learning in which youth initiate the learning and there's shared decisions with adults. And I think that's the sweet spot. And I think the main mindset shift is to identify that, in my opinion, the best, if I were to put an example of the best educator in the world, they're co-learning with students, and they're not the
Mm.
fonts of knowledge. They're not, as you said, the sage on the stage, but they're actually at the end of a lesson. they're saying to
Mm.
their students, wow, you taught me something. I learned something new that I'd never learned today. And
Yeah.
there's a co-learning framework. And I think, as you said, we grew up in an education system where there were some teachers and some educators that operated like that. And
Yeah.
that's, the other piece I often say is that the system might be broken, but there are some unbelievable people operating inside that system. And
Yeah.
diamonds in the rough, or whatever the analogy you want to use. And I think those mindsets and the people who can do really transformational, powerful work inside school systems that are super structured, those are the ones that you want to look at and be like, how are you able to do this? What was it about your teacher training that allowed you to do this? And this is an anecdotal study, but I would bet all my life savings that they had somebody who taught them in that way, and that
Yeah.
inspired them to then learn how to do that. Um, it wasn't just that they read a book by Krishnamurti and were like, oh, this is great, I should try this. It's that they read a book and they're like, oh yeah, Mr. Devons, I remember Mr. Devons. That's the type of teacher he was. I want to be like Mr. Devons, and I'm going to listen to what Krishnamurti has. So I think the mindset shift there is really around, you know, what does excellence look like in our profession as educators? Um, and I I think also in the realm of experiential education, you have to create space for safe failure. Um,
Mm.
and that's super uncomfortable for most teachers.
Mm.
Uh, and they don't want their kids to fail. And parents don't want their kids to fail. No one wants, but that's really where the learning is. And so
Yeah.
I think that's my thoughts on the educator. I I don't know about parents. I'm a forming parent myself. And so I think one of my core principles around parenting is don't judge other parents,
Mm.
and never give anyone parenting advice. So I'm not going to give anyone parenting advice. I'm just going to say what my practice is as a parent. And
Okay.
in the realm of experience, like creating experiential learning in my home, and the home that my wife and I create, we really look at saying, I'm sorry, I was wrong and I made a
Mm.
mistake. And showing our kids that we're vulnerable and that we're not perfect. Um, and then I think the other thing that we do a lot about is trying to reflect and storytell and talk about
Mm.
our 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 learnings as we're going, and model
Mm.
the experiential learning cycle. And so I think valuing that, and I always think about time, like where you spend your time is how you show what you value. And with
Oh.
my kids, where if I'm processing my day with them, of saying,
Mm.
hey, I had a really difficult day today, and this is why it was hard for me, and I'm spending time processing with them. I'm showing them
Mm.
that, one, my time with them, I value my time, but also I value processing with them and that they're co-learning with me. Um, and again, I'm not perfect in this. Sometimes it's just, again, no, I try not to give people parenting advice, just my own
Sure.
journey of what I'm trying to do. Yeah, those are my two things on teachers and educators and parents.
Super. Thank you so much, Justin. I think that's really powerful. Allow kids to fail and then learn from their failures, whether at home or at school, and just model the kind of behavior that you want to see in them. Just model thinking,
Mm,
processing, and accepting failures. So, this is your two big takeaways for us,
mm.
yeah, in terms of
Yeah.
mindset shifts. Super. This has been fabulous. I am sure we can continue going on for hours if we continue this
Mm.
discussion, but then we are at the end of our time today. And it has been wonderful chatting with you. Thank you so much once again for making the time for Tapas Project Shala. And if any of the viewers have any questions, please do leave it in comments. We'll make sure that we send it to Justin, take his answers, and send them back. to you. So
Yeah, so my commitment, I know I'm not able to be in the session live, but my commitment is if you send me back those questions, I'll record another video to
okay.
answer questions and comments and respond to stuff and send it back so you can share it back out with all the participants.
That's really generous of you. Thank you so much, Justin, for
My
that.
pleasure.
And we will take you up on that very soon. So, thank you, everybody. See you at the next session of Tapas Project Shala. Have a good one. Bye bye.
Have a good day.